I'm very excited to collaborate today with Kim Wood, who is a true willing and able program advocate. Welcome, Kim.
Thanks, Kerri. Happy to be here.
Kim, we've been working together for years, and I know a lot of people over lots of different companies know you as the ultimate willing and able, aka skill will program owner. You've trained thousands of leaders and contributors on this 4-box method over all these years. And you've rolled out that program across multiple companies and helped even build the early prototype for Scalibrium back at OutSystems. Do you mind just giving a quick intro and talk about some of the roles you've held and how you've helped all these go-to-market teams succeed?
Yeah, sure. I've had the pleasure of working in high tech now for about 28 years, believe it or not, with large international software companies. And I've helped those companies increase their go-to-market penetration by ensuring that their sellers and pre-sales employees can articulate the value and impact for the customers that they serve. So I got involved specifically with building willing and able programs back in the late 90s, early 2000s at BMC Software. And at the time, BMC was looking for a way to have a more consistent coaching conversation with their sales employees. And a team began to look at what was the difference between a high-performing sales personnel or those that needed more coaching. And basically, the Willing and Able program was born. Based on that successful experience and the value that we gained, I've been able to take that general concept and deploy it now across 3 different additional companies, continuously improving and modifying the program so that it can meet the needs of those businesses.
Yeah, thank you for that. So you've clearly been an advocate for these programs and all these roles. From your perspective, why do you think they matter? Why should organizational leaders get behind this whole process?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kerri. I think willing and able programs are critical so that both the sellers in an organization as well as the leaders maintain that consistent feedback between both parties. With that consistency and repeatability, it allows for the coaching conversations to be part of the norm and focusing on what the data is showing and then making small incremental improvements over time versus waiting for, let's say, an annual review process where you potentially missed the opportunity to correct a skill gap before it became detrimental either to the individual or to the business.
Yeah, really well said. Thank you, Kim. So can you take a minute to talk about the evolution of the programs, which changed over the years, what has stayed consistent quarter over quarter?
Yeah, absolutely. The great news is most of the core tenets of the Willing and Able program has stayed the same. So regardless across the multiple iterations or the different companies, it's basically stayed the same. And a lot of it revolves around this concept of quarterly consistent conversations or even biannual consistent conversations paired with that coaching and dialogue surrounding the skills that someone needs to overperform in their role. And then crafting some sort of continuous improvement plan that happens early and often. That's pretty much remained the same regardless of the company that the program has been implemented at.
Yeah, definitely the consistency of doing that needs to happen on a repeatable basis. So anything else that you've seen across this evolution?
Yeah, I'll say it's definitely more automated now. We used to work off VLOOKUPs and spreadsheets, taking hours and days worth of effort to link everything together to ensure a clean roll-up from contributor all the way up to the highest leader.
Oh, I was with you. I was with you across all of that. I mean, we would send out a spreadsheet to an individual person. They would load it in a place like SharePoint or Box. They would complete it, and then the leader would have to go in and complete it. And we'd have to compile them all together, be like cutting and pasting everywhere. And then we'd have to chase all the final things. So everything was a whole effort, especially, with the amount of data that we had to pull in together. And we had such a short time frame to do it. Oh, it was painful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it brings nightmares.
Yeah, I know. I know. I definitely remember like lots of those days where we were just doing lots of spreadsheet work. So automation is key.
Yeah, and at a place like BMC, I mean, we had hundreds of reps. So the effort required to maintain that manual process and then execute on it well was really challenging. So this is what excites me so much about Scalibrium and automating that process for all of the prospects and customers coming on board.
Yeah, oh, me too. It's only taking minutes now, so it's great. Yeah, thank you, Kim. So, Kim, let's do the math. You started this program in BMC about 2005. You administered, let's say, 300 assessments every quarter. Each one had a series of steps, self-assessment, leader ratings, 101. So how many coaching assessments do you think you've done over, those 18 plus years?
Oh, gosh, I knew you'd ask me something like this. So, yeah, I did a little bit of back of napkin math here for you. I would say I've administered and reviewed upward of about 100,000 assessments over the years across 4 different companies.
Wow, that's a lot. So what insights, did you see different trends? You've had thousands of individuals charted on a 4-box, quarter over quarter, that consistency. So what did you see?
The biggest insight that I have from all of these assessments is initially when a program begins, individuals tend to rate themselves higher than necessarily that the data supports. And what also happens in that first quarter is the coaching conversations begin to happen. And so there's a bit of a reality check, right, where the leader and the contributor are coming together on their understanding of the individual's performance that's supported by the various data points. And they start to have conversations around any discrepancies they may have in their ratings across individual and manager. And then the second quarter, generally, you would see a correction. So individuals were a little bit more conservative in their rating of themselves and closer to where their manager was as well. So over time, what you would see is a convergence of contributor rating and leader rating of that contributor, and they continue to get closer and closer, where over time, then the leader would begin to rate the contributor actually higher than the contributor rating themselves. So what you would see is a continuous improvement in a particular skill, for example, which is ultimately the goal of the program, right? We want our contributors and our leaders to excel on the skills that make them successful in their role. So having this repeatable process where the coaching conversations happen regularly and they begin to align and come closer together in their understanding of both the data and the more subjective parts of the role between both leader and contributor, they become closer over time, and essentially success comes out of that.
No, I like it. I liked how you described just the changes that you can expect to see. And it sounds like it's very normal, right? That it's just learning, what good looks like, right? And then both agreeing and aligning to that. And again, that consistency that you mentioned earlier, super important. The repeatability of doing it over and over gives you those insights. And like you said, the ultimate goal is to have that continual skill improvement.
Exactly. So it's not a bad thing that the leader and contributor might be far apart on the first couple times, because they're starting to learn using the data and the subjective kind of opinion about a skill and mastery. They begin to come closer together because they're having those regular conversations. So then they start to understand the nuances, and ultimately we just want them to improve on those skills. So you see the ratings start to correct themselves over time.
Great, thank you. So Kim, I know I have my own point of view on this next question, but from your perspective, what do you think works in terms of the rollout of these programs holistically across an entire organization?
That's a great question, Kerri. The reality is these types of programs are only successful when there's a few things taken into account. from my experience. The first is executive buy-in. Everyone in the leadership chain needs to agree that regular, consistent coaching conversations deployed in an automated way is meaningful to improve the productivity of their staff. Without that buy-in, you'll see the program start to decline over time and stop providing the value that it's intended to. The second thing would be a strong partnership with the HR or people leadership team in your organization. Even though it might be the field teams that are leading this particular process, it needs to connect in and be relevant to the HR process in place so that it doesn't cause any confusion or misalignment on the purpose of what the program is there to achieve, which is essentially skills alignment and skills improvement. And thirdly, not only is the leadership buy-in important, but the commitment to the process is extremely important as well. We often get bogged down in regular cadence within our sales communities with business review meetings, forecast meetings, customer meetings, clearly, and other kind of one-on-one conversations with team members. However, missing out on that coaching conversation and using data to support that conversation would be detrimental to the individuals you're trying to celebrate or remediate, as the case may be, if there's not commitment across the board.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. So I heard buy-in, I heard partnership with the HR team, and then the leader support, the commitment to the whole process. Anything else that they should keep in mind as a best practice?
Yeah, finally, I would say repeatability of the process is key as well. What people expect and are used to, they're more likely to participate in a process that they're familiar with. So having the entire coaching process put together on a regular timeline becomes a predictable part of their day or month and their selling motion and what they're expecting from the organization. And that way, they're able to bring in a more continuous improvement on themselves because they understand that this is going to be a regular part of their day and they're going to constantly be getting feedback from their leadership chain.
Oh, I like that. I think the repeatable timeline is super important because when people expect something, they're not surprised by it and they're not put off by that process. It just becomes an expected part of their role. So really well said. Buy-in, HR partnership, leadership support, and then this repeatability to the timeline.
Yeah, that would be my biggest lessons learned or success criteria.
Okay, so let's take the opposite question. What doesn't work so well? Any gotchas you've encountered? Any tips for what to avoid?
Yeah, I think the two biggest things to avoid or what doesn't work in these types of programs is if it's inconsistent and then there's a lack of buy-ins. And we've touched on these a little bit before, obviously, in the previous question. But what doesn't work is when coaching is inconsistent and not predictable. The employee may be operating on and understanding or conducting business in a way that doesn't support the goals of the business or their role. And they may become frustrated when it could have been dealt with through that repeatable and predictable process that can catch it before it gets out of hand. And secondly, what doesn't work is when there's not buy-in. So conversely to the question before, it is important that the leadership team in the company believe in the value of coaching and that predictable, consistent conversation that leads to a more productive seller in the community. This can be backed up with performance data as well and give the organization the opportunity to make tweaks in either the skills profile of a particular role if they're seeing data showcase something that isn't part of the profile, for instance. And if you don't have that buy-in and aren't consistently doing this process, then you miss out on the opportunities to come back and refine, for instance, the profiles of a successful rep so that you're continuously getting more and more productive reps in your sales force, as an example of one role.
Yeah, I think it's super important to continuously advocate the why behind what you're doing so that the perception of it being perceived as an admin burden or something else can just be negated a little bit and can deflect when new leadership or something comes on board. It is already given that it is a positive reinforcement mechanism, and it's something that is always done consistently and has such great results. And so I appreciate that. I definitely know when you don't have the buy-in, these kinds of programs can get really difficult.
Yeah, no, totally agree.
So, Kim, you're familiar with the platform, how we have a wizard, and that wizard helps program owners come in and set up answer a couple questions, and then launch their programs. Because it's so familiar with what you've done in the past, I was hoping that you could share your best practices at each point in the process. Our wizard starts people at the review period, which is, the look back period of time. So would you mind, sharing any best practices on picking a review period across your program?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. The best practice for a review period is first to ensure that the review is consistent and often enough that if there are any skills gaps that seem immense, it doesn't affect the company's yearly performance goal. So having a review that's quarterly, for instance, is generally a best practice, where annually is generally not enough. Some companies I have seen do a biannual process. So I generally see the best practice would be quarterly, but certainly not annual.
And I know I've been working with some business development teams who actually have benchmarks that they're trying to meet each month. And so they prefer to do it as a monthly look back period because they can tie it to when results are in and they can see the changes month by month.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So why don't we go to the next one, which is in terms of the timing that you want to set for deadlines around self-assessment all the way to the end when the final one-on-ones should be done. Do you have any recommendations for setting that full time frame from start to end, program kickoff to program end?
Yep. As far as the timeframes are concerned, this is varied quite drastically, actually, across the different organizations that I've worked with. Originally, it was a 2-week process end to end. Individuals rated themselves in 1 week. The leaders completed their rating the following week and wrapped up the coaching conversations that same week. Now, more recently, in a different company I've worked with, the time frame has been closer to a 6-week process. And that was adapted in order to allow for other business commitments and planning commitments that the different roles had in the organization. So in general, I believe the sweet spot is consistently doing a review for the contributors in that first week of a quarter, and certainly completing the full process by the end of that first month in a quarter.
Okay, nice. And so when you're doing a look back period of a quarter, then you give them basically the first month of the start of the next quarter to do it. Our system currently enforces, at least 3 days in between the process to give people time to have unique deadlines. But I have seen when you're doing a shorter look back period, a shorter review period, that you could squeeze those dates. So if you're looking back in the previous month, you can really set your end to end, in the week time frame because self-assessments can be shorter. Yeah. Fair. So on to the next part in the process. It's who do you pick to be in this program? So any best practices there?
I would say generally the best practice is to focus certainly on the sales functions, like quota carriers and their leaders, and even the pre-sales technical profiles within your organization that support those various quota carriers. What I've seen in this type of program, when it extends into other areas within the broader selling ecosystem, it actually helps establish broader consistency and a language in the organization. And the broader sales team tend to rally around a certain set of skills that are universal across that organization, and then the specific roles. So it allows conversations to come out between the different supporting organizations.
And then when you pick those participants, at a minimum, your sales teams, but the best practices, of course, the whole field, who evaluates them? We have a shortcut in the system for assigning their leaders, so whoever their direct manager is. Is that a best practice from what you've seen?
Yeah, in general, the easiest and the most effective solution is the first line leader of that individual, whomever is rating themselves, is the best person to evaluate their skill mastery and willingness, if you will, and their abilities across the organization. If you go outside of that or you go too far up, they lose context. So having that first line leader, whoever is the direct manager of the individual, is the best one to evaluate their performance.
Yeah, thank you. So the next thing they pick is what assessment do they use. So we know that can take a lot more time, gain agreement on particular questions to ask, categories, and so on. Do you have any best practices around that?
Sure. This is actually the most challenging part, if I'm honest, and it's been repeated across multiple companies. The skills themselves need to be defined at a generic enough level that it's meaningful across different regions, different geographies, potentially slightly different nuances between a seller's profile, and other roles that support them. But again, it can't be so specific that those regional nuances actually take over the assessment and they become way too long and people get fed up with the process. So it's crucial to ensure that for each role, that the leadership for that role has participated in creating and understanding the skills that you are going to be asking questions about and the abilities that they need to have in their particular role.
I think, yeah, sorry to interrupt there. I think that what I've seen a lot of people ask is what is the best practices for the number of questions? And I usually defer back to them, which is, we want to give you a pool of questions that then you can define your best practices. And I like the way you put it, which is you want to give them enough to make it meaningful, but not enough to where it just seems like it is way too many questions and taking everybody too much time.
Yeah. As long as it's specific to the actual abilities needed to be successful in that particular role that you're evaluating in, that's enough. It doesn't need to be an exhaustive review process. It needs to focus on the core abilities that you need that particular role to have to be successful and ask the questions related to those.
So the last thing you can do in the platform is set up your notifications. So that's just tell people what they're doing and help them get into the system to do the assessment process. Any best practices there around notifications?
Yeah, I definitely have a set of best practices, but we'll also acknowledge that this too has been quite varied across the organizations that I've worked in. And it really depends on the timing, the timing period that you've set for the assessment itself as to how often you would want to notify or remind someone to remain compliant within that time frame. What I mean by that is if your process is elongated, so in my 6-week example that I mentioned before, notifications are generally needed to be sent more often because individuals may forget because they might have 3 weeks to actually complete their willing and able assessment. So reminding them on a weekly basis of, hey, you haven't done this yet, it's due on X date, isn't an obnoxious amount of notification. Whereas if the program time frame is more finite, for instance, in the 2-week example, generally you only need to send a notification when the assessment starts to kick it off, and maybe the day before the assessment period ends for anyone who hasn't been able to complete that. And potentially one more to catch those who are past due, but it's definitely a cleaner process from my experience. When the time frame of the overall assessment is more finite, then you're not having to chase people as often.
Yeah, I like that. You know what I love about the platform is that we've made bulk reminders so easy. you don't have to go do all of that manual reporting that we talked about previously with pulling the list of who's done it and who hasn't done it and then sending them the specific email. Now you can click one button and it looks for whatever status they're in and sends the right email. So really excited about that in terms of notifications. Kim, we just got through talking about all the things you do to set up a program. Now let's switch gears and talk about what you do when the program is running. What do you do during the program? So as an admin, what are things you're looking out for? Any best practices there?
Sure. During a program, the admin work is more dedicated to monitoring and ensuring successful completion by the individuals involved. My biggest role as an admin of the program before it was actually launched, because I needed to ensure that the correct skills were attributed to the right roles and everyone understood and was mapped appropriately to receive the correct assessment. This is why I'm so excited about Scalibrium, because it automates that and marries up this concept of, based on the role they fulfill in the organization, they get assigned the appropriate assessment for their ability, their willing and able assessment. So that really frees up the time of the admin, and really then you can start to focus on looking at the data that's coming in, looking at trends, perhaps reporting back to the leaders and looking for any gaps that you might need to fill before the next assessment is started. So it makes for such a more efficient and streamlined administration process.
Great. So we heard about what you did before, what you do during the programs, and then let's talk about after. So a program wraps up. What are all the housekeeping items that you do to make sure that it's rolled out, that it's tied up with a nice bow?
Generally, when a program wraps up, I'm focusing on communicating the completion of the assessment program and the time period. And as I mentioned before, looking at those trends at a higher level and across different role types to understand if there's maybe a larger remediation challenge that needs to be addressed, or specific training that needs to happen on a broader scope. Otherwise, again, having it all automated within a platform like Scalibrium allows the administrator, when it comes to wrap up, to focus on communicating the end of the program, looking at trends and statistics, and preparing for the next iteration of when it might roll out to make any fine-tuning or tweaks that might need to happen. So it really simplifies the entire process.
Neat. Well, Kim, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. I mean, I had some flashbacks with all of our old manual days of reporting, but really appreciate you sharing your experience today and giving, really nice perspective across the whole journey of assessment programs. So thank you.
Absolutely. The pleasure was mine. Thanks so much, Kerri.
Thank you.